Welcome to our webinar, On Their Level, a conversation about youth recruitment and engagement. My name is Aisha Moore, and I am the Project Director of What Works in Youth HIV. For those of you who are not familiar with What Works in Youth HIV, we are a project that is operated by JSI Research and Training, an international public health organization, and What Works in Youth HIV is funded through a cooperative agreement with the Office of Adolescent Health with funding from the HHS Secretary's Minority AIDS Initiative Fund. To learn more about us, please visit whatworksinyouthhiv.org. The goal of What Works in Youth HIV is to improve the health and well-being of America's adolescents by providing practical and innovative website content that empowers youth-serving providers to meet the needs of youth at highest risk for HIV/AIDS. Our strategies are to support and promote interventions, to better integrate HIV prevention focused on youth, to promote evidence-based programs and practices, and to connect with training and technical assistance opportunities, including social media and educational campaigns. You can find all of this type of information right on our website. So today, this webinar, we're having it because we did a short, brief needs assessment back in the fall, and the number one thing that people said that was a challenge for them was recruiting and engaging youth into programs. And from that, we decided that we needed to directly address that by having this webinar, as well as you will see some other things coming out around National Youth HIV/AIDS Awareness Day. So the objectives for this webinar are to understand why recruitment and engagement are common challenges for youth-serving programs, describe program attributes for the tailored recruitment of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, LGBT, homeless, and urban youth, and identify one recruitment or engagement strategy that you can apply in your program. So this topic is so important because we all know that you work very, very hard to do what you do, and that work is only possible when you have youth in your programs and the youth stay long enough to get the messages that they need in order to prevent HIV. So this webinar is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a conversation, and there's not a lot of information in the slides. So you want to make sure that you have your pen and pad ready to write down all of the wonderful strategies our panelists are going to talk about. So we're going to have speaker introductions, then we're going to have a conversation question number one, presentation of strategies by our three panelists, and then another conversation question. So we're going to use a tool called an idea board, and the link has been chatted to you. And on that idea board, you can answer the questions right along with the presenter. So click on the link, and once you open it, press the green plus sign to be able to add an idea to the board. And if you see something that you like, you can also give it a thumbs up. So now we're going to introduce our three speakers. Meet Timothy Kordic. He manages the HIV/AIDS prevention unit for the Los Angeles Unified School District. He's been working in the field for 10 years, and he's in charge of all of the sexual health programs at the school district from K through 12. Next, meet Dr. Maranda Ward. She's a community educator, curriculum developer, and youth builder, and she teaches in school and in out-of-school spaces as a faculty and public health practitioner. She's committed to amplifying the youth voice, preserving community and civic identity, and advancing health equity. And finally, meet Lamar Anderson. He's a community mobilizer for the DC Prevention Center in Wards 5 and 6 with over 13 years of experience. He focuses on increasing youth involvement as it pertains to issues directly affecting their communities, and he's motivated to create positive change in the lives of youth in DC. So now we're going to open up the lines of all three of our panelists and get them to answer this question. So what makes recruiting and engaging youth in programs so challenging? So part of the story to this webinar is that, so first thing we did was we did the survey where people told us that this was a challenge, so we went out to ask people for their ideas of how to solve that challenge, and we frankly, we didn't get a lot of people responding because we think it's a challenge. A lot of people are like, let us know when you guys know the answer to this question. So I want to first start with Tim and just ask you, why do you think this is so hard for people who work with youth?
Well, sometimes you think you have things in place and you don't realize that it's not necessarily always relevant to your age category, to your race, to the gender. All those things play into why it's so challenging, and also things evolve, and so youth evolve, and things you've done in the past don't always work now.
Thanks, Tim. And what about you, Maranda?
Okay, so I'm going to say when it comes to both recruiting and engaging youth organizations find themselves competing with other interests that the youth holds, right? So sometimes you're working with students who are also athletes or are involved in other extracurricular activities. And so it just doesn't work for them to kind of stay engaged. And then there's also the fact that sometimes you're also just competing with life. So if you know anything about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you'll know that basically if the youth doesn't know where the next meal is coming from or if they're going to have a place to stay tonight, they're probably not going to prioritize the workshop on goal setting. Right? So that's, you know, these are just basic recruitment engagement challenges. But specifically to recruitment, you know, some of us actually serve very specific demographics of youth. And so the question becomes, where do I find the subpopulation that I'm specifically targeting? So this is where I would suggest long-term partnerships come in, plus your sustained work in any given community is where you and your organization kind of can gain community trust, and then you can become a household name. But then when it comes to engagement, like Tim said, it's challenging because to engage youth, you have to take into consideration the dynamic nature of this age group, let alone the other intersections of their identities. And so, you know, later in today's webinar, I'm going to share some strategies on how to do just that.
Thank you. I think that's so important to think about, not, you know, just competing for their attention. Sometimes people say, oh, we're competing their attention for video games or for, you know, sports and that kind of thing, but sometimes it's for those basic needs as well. All right, Lamar, you ready to weigh in?
Yes. So for me, I feel that a lot of the recruitment challenges come from just, again, kind of meeting the youth where they are. So at points, we as adults use the methods that were used for us when we were youth, but again, those methods aren't currently working anymore because we have the age of social media where a lot of things are done in hand. So, you know, they're using a phone to kind of, you know, do everything, even communicate with their peers. So a lot of that, you know, when we're still trying to use our old methods of recruitment, we have to definitely go into the age of technology where you're using now Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat to kind of get your message across, whatever that may be, but also using that as a great recruitment tool as well.
Thank you so much, Lamar, Maranda, and Tim. And some of the things that we're seeing on the idea board are some of the same things that you said. So one, I see here a couple of times, a lot of people did like +3 on the transportation challenges, and one person got really specific to say that, you know, youth often lack autonomy in their transportation. So if they want to go to a program that has something to do with HIV or sexual health, and their parents have to drive them there, then that's going to be a confidentiality problem. So that's something definitely to be considered. Another one that has some pluses on it is that, you know, their time is not often compensated or incentivized. And I always ask adults to put ourselves in their shoes, like how many of us have goals around maybe nutrition or something like that, but how many of us are like getting off of work and wanting to go to that free nutrition class down at the local church? A lot of us don't attend those as well, so we should really think about that. Why do we have that same expectation for youth, and what are the things we can do to incentivize them to want to give us their precious time? All right, so this discussion has been great. So now we're going to move into the presentation of strategies. And so what I asked each panelist to do was just give us 3 quick strategies. And so the way this sort of webinar is set up, there's not a lot of information on the slides. You're really going to have to pay attention. So you might want to close out your other tabs right now, get your notebook out, get your pen out so you can write these things down. So we're going to move to Tim Kordic, and he's going to talk to us about tailoring recruitment for Latino and Black men who have sex with men. So Tim will tell us a little bit about his project and his 3 strategies. Take it away, Tim.
Thank you. So yes, we were funded through a federal grant to work on with these Black Latino YMSM populations that we now call adolescent sexual minority males as our new terminology. But our goal was to do an evidence-based intervention that we modified. It was 3MV, and we modified it for youth. Now we modified it into 2 different cohorts and 2 different streams, one for Latinos and one for Black youth. And we contracted with a CBO partner to make that happen. And specifically that CBO partner because a huge part of their population that they served were these youth. And so we wanted to make sure that we had our people in place. Saying that, you think immediately that you have everything together, you've done the right thing, and then you realize as you begin to do this that, wait a second, we have barriers here. And just like we had discussed in some of the other conversations around these kind of social determinants of health that affect our youth, that affects how we do it, and that creates barriers for us. So for us, do we have some of the strategies that some of the things we had to conquer were, for the training purposes, do we have the correct people on the ground? Do they reflect that demographic? Do they reflect that orientation or identity? You know, when we are promoting and recruiting, are we using the correct types of recruitment tools that don't reverse create stigma? Because we reverse stigma things all the time, so it ends up shaming youth, and we don't see it sometimes as adults. We think that there's going to be, you put these stats out or these things out, and you think you're going to wow them or you're going to scare them. That just creates shame for them. And many times understanding the vocabulary, because in many cases we use vocabulary that adults use and not that youth use. And coming from the educational world as well, many times we use educational terms. And so we had to get down to the level of what vocabulary we actually use as well. And then again, with our subpopulations, what are we dealing with? And with populations where, you know, we're 80% Latino in Los Angeles and in our district, and then a small portion of that is African American and Black youth. And we had to make sure that we were using the correct language. And in fact, our program is named by them. So when we brought this evidence-based intervention, we let them give it a name for us. To make sure there was buy-in for that. And then, of course, age restrictions. You know, when you're dealing with certain populations, and I'm dealing with high school students and teens, that age restriction can also hinder you. And then again, it was just mentioned before, transportation is a huge issue. And if you can't conquer that issue, you're going to have problems, especially if you don't have gang-neutral locations, and if you're making sure these kids are not crossing those gang lines. And so we provided vouchers for buses, we provided Uber-type style transportation. We made sure all that was happening. And then again, somebody mentioned also parental active consent. Depending on how you're working with these kids, do you require that? Do you need that? Because that could be a huge barrier as well. And we learned from that because we did do that at one point, and we learned immediately to change that policy. So those things were really, really important to us. But how do we recruit was a really big deal. And so we found 2 levels of recruitment. One was with peer health ambassadors that we trained as linkages to care, kind of peer-to-peer model in the schools where they did guerrilla marketing. None of our recruitment was done in a large piece where we did it at the school site where we advertised it that way. None of it was done that way because we didn't want to shame, we didn't want to stigmatize, and from focus groups we heard from youth, they didn't want us to do that either. So what we did was we had these peer health ambassadors that would go around with postcards, some social media that went viral as well, and recruited that way. So making sure we did that. We also trained a group of near peers that were just out of high school but lived in the area in that community and worked with the CBO partner, and we trained them to actually be in the community, do the exact same thing that our peers were doing in the school. So we're targeting the community and targeting the school setting. And then, of course, the materials you use is a huge part of this. And if you're using materials that are not working for them, that's a really big deal. And what we learned primarily is the look, the feel, the vibe, and the language that you use and the labels that you use to label these groups make a really big deal. So we learned that we had to be really flexible in our language, and we moved from a very, I would say, boring recruitment tool to one that went to music and things like that, to one that went to what really worked for them was what made them feel empowered and transformed by this. And being able to use terminology that was not just specific to just only gay and bisexual, pansexual, questioning, queer, curious, and gender loving. We used multiple language strategies to be able to make sure we were trying to get what we wanted, and that was really difficult. And one of the big learning pieces, and one of the things that we weren't allowed to do was to invite transgender youth into these groups yet until the IRB process was completed. And so not being able, we had to change terminology, like making sure they said male born and things like that for who we recruited for, to make sure that we didn't have transgender youth feel hurt or ashamed if they called and tried to be part of this, and we had to say no to them. So we made sure the recruitment were clear about that as well. But the big things that we had to make sure happened was the support from the NGO was key, because they really, we had an NGO that worked with us on this and worked on making sure everything was, the language was correct, that the marketing was on top of it, and the training for the facilitators was good as well. Again, a big part of this was framing. Everything was framed in a specific way. And the last thing I would say is making sure that your trainers and your people that you work with for youth, whether it's a teacher, are trained well in how they deliver messages, how they use their language, because what ends up happening is that if these youth still live within the paradigms of their families and their parents and their guardians, and so many times the things that could shame somebody else in a group setting or is really easy, whether it's a classroom setting or whether it's an event or a support group, or those things happen really easily. And if you don't have somebody who is facilitating that conversation, whether as a teacher or a facilitator for a group, be able to turn that around. And I'll give an example. In some of our groups, we already knew that some of our youth were positive. But when you're speaking to youth, a lot of times when you start mentioning that, they start making comments like, gross, ew, gross, I would never date that. Well, when you have somebody in the group who already is that and has that status, then you want to make sure that you're turning that around. You want to make sure facilitators are on top of it. You'll turn that around and not shame and have them come back. And the last thing I will say is finding a home for these youth was really important. So being able to find a CBO partner that had wraparound services and had pieces to make that home for them was really important. So outside of just testing, it was a facility where they can go as a community outreach place and not only worry about their health, but there were things around media and performing arts and things like that that attached them to it after the fact. So it was a sustainable strategy.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that just really robust description of all the strategies that you're using. And because I'm the moderator, I can give my own feedback on it. And one of the things that really struck me as you're at the Los Angeles Unified School District, and that's actually the school district that I went to growing up. Is where I first became a peer educator. And one thing I want to point out about what you said, I want other people to hear, is about the cultural intelligence of what you did. So specifically, that whole piece around the gang culture that's really, really strong in LA to this day, sadly, and how you had to make sure that, you had to really think about where am I placing my program, how do I get people to cross territorial lines that may be unsafe for them, because that is their reality. And so I think it's really important for everyone listening to really have that cultural intelligence, and when we do focus groups and ask the questions, like, really dig deep into what are the, don't just assume what the barriers are. There might be some barriers there that we don't even consider. So thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you.
All right, so now we're going to go to Dr. Maranda Ward, and she's going to tell you about her Youth Pipeline program, Promising Futures. Take it away, Maranda.
Okay, so my strategy is going to come up after the next slide. Okay, perfect. There we go. Okay, so one, thank you, Aisha, for actually pulling out what Tim mentioned about the gang culture in LA, because like you, I also grew up in LA Unified, so that cultural intelligence is critically important. But what I'd like to do is share 3 strategies that have worked for me to keep youth engaged in my youth development pipeline. And so one of those strategies is the importance of investing in developmentally appropriate long-term programming options. So I'm starting with the idea that it's worthwhile to invest in long-term programming. Youth want to be involved in the constructive use of out-of-school time beyond just the one-time workshop or even a summer camp. This explains my program model of engaging youth as young as 11 and as old as 24. The youth can then age into different programming options, which then gets into it being developmentally appropriate. So the middle school youth, they serve as ambassadors in a curriculum-based program that's really designed to focus on what the evidence shows is central to early adolescence, that being determining their values, that being discovering their interests, and that also being learning to think beyond themselves. The high school youth who either those middle school youth age into or high school youth join, they actually serve as peer educators, and we use what's called edutainment. So we use hip-hop, theater, and poetry to make a range of issues come alive in performance-based workshops. And these youth are really honing in on their skills and talents. They're developing their social and emotional intelligences and competencies. They're making sense of their multiple and conflicting identities. So using their bodies and using their brains, they actually come up with material using mediums that are relevant to their peers. And then, yes, they earn community service credit in the process alongside their budding civic identities. And then the youth builders who are out of high school return to the program as mentors, as facilitators and speakers. They earn money to the questions that were posed in our conversation with, everyone else on the webinar. Yes, we do pay the youth who actually come and we compensate them for their time and their talent. So they earn money and additional work experience as they pursue a range of fields from public health, business marketing, and STEAM professions. And so ultimately, what I appreciate about this type of model is that it's very fluid. So it does allow youth to have the autonomy to decide if they can, if they want to complete the pipeline or, where and when they'll enter or exit. So, but I will say we have been fortunate to have program continuity because we actually have been able to capitalize on these long-term relationships and rapport that, we've been able to develop with the youth and their families, which brings me to the next strategy that I find helpful, which is meaningfully engaging youth in program decisions and processes. So, what do I mean by meaningfully? Well, I know that's relative, but what I found as meaningful engagement is when youth are actually engaged in hiring decisions. So, for example, it's almost like in an academic setting, they'll have you do a job talk. So similarly, I'll have interview, prospective hires and have them prepare a workshop of sorts. And they do a simulated workshop with youth in my program. And so youth from all portions of the pipeline engage in this simulation, and then we'll debrief. And then they also are, part of that interview process as well. But then I'll debrief with them about, to Tim's point, okay, so what do you think about the language that they use, I guess the way they made you feel, the space that they created, the actual activities? Could you see them working with you, with other youth, things like that? And so the youth really are able to get a feel for how they think the applicant thinks about them, thinks about youth more broadly, thinks about youth programming. And so they appreciate that process. And then also the youth who are high school youth in the peer education program, they also interview and weigh in on upcoming cohorts of other peer educators because they spent so much time developing a community and a culture within the peer education program that they want to help to facilitate or maintain that culture. Youth are also meaningfully engaged in our collateral. So, they design the T-shirts. So, like right now, they're actually wearing like a baseball tee, the black sleeves, so the door goes to your elbows, and then on the front it's like a silk screen of a mural that they actually hand drew and painted last summer when we were hosting community conversations. But they were so consumed with the sense of identity and the sense of purpose and sense of pride that came from that project, which was really focused on the rich history and culture of DC, that they were like, no, we want to rock this, and we want to wear this shirt. We want to put that on our T-shirts and rock that. So, and then they also participate in photo shoots for the website and, you know, very attuned to all of the ways that the program defines and describes who they are as urban youth. And, you know, I definitely don't subscribe to the language around, like, at-risk, you know, inner city type of youth. They will never find any of that type of language on any of our material or websites. They're also engaged in event logistics, anything from, okay, so we're going to host a graduation celebration, what type of team building activities you want to do, to what type of food and snack, you know, options we have from week to week. So I share all that to say it's worthwhile to determine when and how to engage youth in administrative and program decisions. Given that I rely on a pipeline model, the youth are quite invested from the outset, making their input that much more important and meaningful for all involved. And finally, I found it very important to strategically align programming to the values, needs, and interests of youth. And like we talked about before, when we opened up, like, why is it so challenging to recruit and engage youth, is because those values, needs, and interests, they change, they're dynamic, right? So your program cannot be stagnant. You can't just be out here doing what you've always done because you feel you don't have the time, money, or talent to support quote-unquote change. This is where youth come in. So, for example, the peer education program could be very prescriptive if I allow funding to solely dictate the content we cover, but I don't. So yes, okay, I have a pregnancy prevention grant. Okay, well, we'll talk about pregnancy and this is why and that kind of thing. But then I definitely ask you, what are some issues of, you know, that are relevant to you? We open up every programming year with a skill and talent inventory, so the entire group is aware of all the competencies in the room. So then once we do discuss the issues that are most pressing for them, we can determine how best to address it based on the, you know, where their talents lie. And so, you know, we have like a lot of visual artists and dancers and, performing artists. And so we kind of really capitalize on that by, you know, hosting graffiti writing workshops, or, you know, like I said, having this, you know, the Canvas Space mural that they use to host community conversations, you know, to the types of, you know, dance performances that they actually put together for like the annual International Conference on Stigma at Howard every year. So basically, programming should not fall flat of the youth who participate in them. The program curriculum and design must be personalized to meet their needs from the day and time and even location where you meet. But while doing that, definitely you're going to maintain high standards, but remain flexible enough to actually accommodate the youth in real time. So those zero tolerance, punitive attendance performance policies are destructive, in my opinion. So that's why, for example, I use, you know, leadership development plans and kind of pair them up with accountability partners. So as an example of how youth can be stretched and pulled productively to, you know, really reach your personal and program goals. And finally, sometimes that agenda that you have for any given program session has to go out the window to make room for the organic and raw emotion that enters the space on any given day. And I found that youth really appreciate when spaces that are carved out for them are really for them, and who they are grows, expands, and looks different from when they entered. So keeping these strategies in mind will make recruiting and retaining youth that much easier.
Thank you, Maranda, so much for what you said, and it really speaks to the fact that about this developmentally appropriate pipeline that you have, and that's what's really keeping them engaged. And then also the idea of that they're sharing their skills and talents, and they get to make decisions, so they're invested. So before we go to our next speaker, I just want to remind you all that we do have the chat box, so you can start to chat in your questions so I can triage them, so we can go right into the Q&A. And now we're going to have our third speaker, Lamar Anderson, talk to us about his work with homeless youth. Take it away, Lamar.
Hey, so when I talk about 3 strategies, my first strategy will be just meeting youth's basic needs. So that's, you know, shelter, clothing, food, transportation, and also social needs. But the thing is with that, I think when you try to access youth, you kind of go, well, most folks go in with their own agenda, but it's like you have to meet them where they are. So if at that point in their life they just need food, then that's what you have to provide for them. They can't come to you wanting food and you're trying to give them clothing, housing, or trying to, you know, put them, register them in school and things of that nature. If that's what they need at that moment, that's what you would most likely need to provide for them is food. So that's the I guess the process that I kind of take, just meeting youth where they are. So whatever that need is or may be at that time, meeting them there. Because, again, if you try to bombard them with what you think they need, then that's kind of pushing them away. So you may say, oh, well, you know what, you may be hungry right now, but I think you need to register in school, or I think you need to go see a social worker, go see that. See, with that, that's kind of turning them away because you're already letting them know that their best interest or what they're interested in at that moment doesn't really matter to you, and that kind of, you know, pushes them away. So for the second strategy, community conversations, and that we host those all around, you know, wards 5 and 6, but that's just basically to kind of gain, you know, what youth overall needs are and the needs of their communities, but it also helps address other things such as allowing them to interact with other youth and network of other youth that are having the same challenges, and also, but not just interacting with them, but finding resources and solutions to those challenges. So it's one thing if you're having those same challenges by yourself, but if you're in a room full of youth that are having the same challenges that you're having, one, it helps you connect that belong in the membership, but also it helps you kind of flush the thoughts out because you feel like, oh, wow, I'm not the only one that's going through this. But then again, it also assists them with creating their own solutions rather than us creating the solutions for them. Lastly, community events, which kind of helps the youth stay connected to the communities, but again, also promotes that belonging in membership. So we've done things in the past such as basketball tournaments, poetry ciphers, fashion shows, and one of the biggest ones was, or the largest ones, was our youth summit, which brought out speakers to talk about, again, issues that youth face, but also, again, ways to combat those issues, but also gave them a chance to do activities with other youth that are facing the same issue. So we had like a prevent and paint, which the artist came out and allowed the youth to paint their own canvas of whatever was going on in their life or however they felt, you know, and that was something that the youth got to keep as well, their artwork. So, you know, for me, those are kind of the three strategies, or, you know, that I kind of take, or we kind of take on, you know, meeting youth where they are.
Thank you so much, Lamar, for describing some of the things that you do. And one of the reasons we invited Lamar to the webinar is because I think sometimes we only think about the traditional spaces where we can meet youth, like at schools and things of that nature, but a lot of times it's the youth who are not connected to those kind of spaces that also need the help. And sometimes people who are trained or traditionally in public health or come from other fields don't know maybe some of the nuances of working with other populations. So I think folks, you really have to think about, okay, so who can your allies be, who are your resources? So, you know, finding a person like Lamar who works specifically with homeless youth, or at an organization that's specifically works with homeless youth, to ask them what their strategies are, to partner with them and do it together. So now we're going to move into the conversation, question number 2. So you can go back to the idea board and put in some suggestions for this. So the question is, well, let me tell you the premise of this question. So Miranda kind of hinted at this, that sometimes we just keep doing the same thing and we forget to really check in to see, you know, if something's not working and we're to stop doing it. So for each person, like, how do you know when it's time to change strategies? Like, what are the signals for you when something's not working? And again, Miranda mentioned like not using the word at risk. And so what's a strategy we should leave behind, or what's something that we just do because we've always been doing it, that we should leave behind. I think that, you know, maybe leaving behind the term at risk is something that I've heard a lot of people say. So just go ahead and chat that, and not chat it, and write on an idea board when you know it's time to change strategies or what's a strategy we should leave behind. And then I will open it up to Tim, Miranda, and Lamar to give your feedback on this. So let's start with Tim again.
Sure. A couple of things. One is you have to talk to youth, and they will point you into the right direction. And so for us, we had to do a lot of that, and a big part of that was having focus groups with our young people, and making sure, and not only that, but also making sure within that focus groups, especially if you're looking at a certain population. For us, a lot of it was under sexual orientation and their sexual identity. What exactly does that mean? And we're getting the voice from them. So even getting it just from the general group isn't enough. So listening to them and knowing where we're going was a big thing. And of course, the bottom line is if you're not getting a response, you know, on things you're doing, something's wrong. And move quickly, because time is your enemy here, and you've got to move quickly. And that's what we did. We really focused on talking to youth and young people, and a big part of that was for them when we talked to them was around transportation lines, and a big part was also how we label things, and if they fell into that category, and if they wanted to label it all.
Thanks, Tim. Miranda, what do you think?
Okay, so to the first question, how do you know when it's time to change strategies? I'll share that, interestingly enough, I actually started Promising Futures as a hip-hop education series. So my co-founders and I would travel around to adolescent health conferences and lead Train the Trainer workshops for youth-serving organizations on how to use hip-hop pedagogy to engage youth in their programs. So while important, this didn't allow us to sow directly into youth ourselves. When we were going to these conferences, we remained in adult-dominated spaces talking about youth rather than working alongside youth, learning from them in the process. So this explains the shift in our program model to a youth development pipeline. So we knew it was time to change strategies because we, as the co-founders, underwent the introspective exercise of reflecting on what brought us to the work in the first place. Now, to the second question, what's a strategy we should leave behind? I would suggest that we leave behind always focusing on who youth should become at the expense of who they are right now. So when programming is always focused on their future self, it has a tendency to really neglect their present self in ways that really disavow and minimize their current interests and capacities and identities. So programming, in my experience, can do both. This is why I love peer education program models, and I'm also a former peer educator, because the set of skills and competencies that they develop are transferable to later in life while taking stock of the issues and realities of today.
Thanks for sharing that. And Lamar?
So how do you know when it's time to change strategies? Well, you know when it's not working. You know when the youth aren't showing up to your programs, the youth aren't as engaged as they were before. But also, as Tim said, like, youth are so direct that they will let you know. They will tell you, hey, this is not working, or hey, this is not interesting. This is not interesting to us anymore. You know, they will let you know. They are, youth are so upfront. They don't really hold any cards. Like, they will tell you, hey, again, we're not interested. This is not holding our attention. I don't want to attend these sessions, things of that nature. So that's definitely, kind of when you know that it's time to change your strategies.
And to all of the people listening, I know a lot of us use some of the approved evidence-based practices by CDC or by Office of Adolescent Health, and both Tim and Miranda talked about their programs being slight adaptation. So Tim talked about using 3MV. That's, Tim, 3MV is many men, many voices, right?
Yes.
Okay, yes, that's what I thought. And then I know, Miranda, your program is based on AIM. So, and if you listen to what they talked about, you probably didn't necessarily recognize either one of those programs as written in what they talked about. So when it's time to leave stuff behind, a lot of times our EBIs are old, a lot of them from the 90s, but that doesn't mean that you can't use some of the strategies that you've learned today to update them. So I just wanted to pull that out to people to know that at least 2 of our presenters are using the EBIs that I know some of you are using. So, you know, just put on your imagination cap, talk to the youth, and see what you can do to move it closer to have more youth attending and staying engaged in your programs. All right. So now we're going to open it up for audience questions. So please chat your questions into the chat box, and we will get them answered. So the first question is for Tim. So someone wants to know if you could say a little bit more about how you're using Uber and other services, because they are in a rural area and transportation is such a challenge for them. So they wanted to hear a little more specifically how you use Uber and how you were able to set that up.
Sure. Well, you know, we're lucky in our area that there's multiple services available. So we were able to either use codes, like Uber codes, or vouchers that we had. And there's other card writing services that are specifically designed for youth that we can use as well. And then in some of the cases where, like for example, one was farther away, and so the executive director picked that student up of the CBO partner and brought them to the location. Sometimes we will work with groups, like maybe a group home or things like that may bring a group with them, and they may bring transportation themselves. It just varies per cohort that we use, and we will look at every single strategy possible. That's really what we have to do, and it's really tailored to whatever their needs are, and they pretty much tell us if they can't do it and why, and then we figure out the solution for them, whether it be again, like a car riding service. Sometimes and many times it's just been a bus voucher, paying for their bus fares, but in other cases, metro fares. So it just depends on the situation. But those are the things and the solutions we have found that work best for us.
Thank you, Tim. So the second question I'm going to toss to Maranda, because someone wants to know if there are any data on outcomes of these programs, because they'd love to be able to use that to back up their own program requests. And so since I know Maranda just recently completed her PhD and did a lot of data collection and things of that nature, can you speak to that a little bit, Maranda?
So I can speak to general adolescent development and youth development programming having outcomes, and then I can speak specifically to my program having outcomes, and I'll start with my program. So to Aisha's point, so I actually engaged the youth in my program, the youth builders, those are 18 to 24-year-olds, in my dissertation research. Yes, so they were literally co-constructing knowledge around the identities, the dual identities they have as peer educators and as urban youth, and so much rich, robust data came from that was able to inform the program, the programming, and even the ways, the conversations that I had with funders moving forward about how funding proposals and, you know, just the call for proposals are framed in ways that become very pathologizing for youth. And for those of us who are practitioners really working on their behalf to kind of change the narrative. And so that has been really helpful. But the Search Institute, which actually develops a lot of the developmental assets, they have a developmental assets framework, and they talk about developmental relationships. They are an incredible resource that has a lot of data actually from, you know, they do cross-sectional, you know, surveys from throughout the United States with a different range of different populations of adolescents. And, you know, they really kind of focus on those internal assets that youth need to kind of grow and thrive. And those are, you know, a range of social and cultural competencies and sense of personal power and positive identity and, you know, feeling connected to one's community and school. Those are like just some examples of those kind of building blocks, but then also that are external to them. And those are really about the where, you know, where these programming kind of comes in and developing, again, those high standards and consistent and, you know, healthy relationships with adults and meaningful roles in the community and things like that. And so I would definitely recommend tapping into the Search Institute for credible research credible and well-researched, validated tools that you can use and to apply to your program.
Thank you, Miranda. And we're getting a lot of questions. I'm not sure if we'll be able to answer them all, but we will see if we can get answers to some of them maybe after the webinar. Okay, so the next question, well, actually, the next question was, are you going to receive a copy of this webinar? And yes, the recording and the slides and a transcript will be available on whatworksinYouthHIV.org. So the next question I'm going to throw out to all of the presenters, the panelists, and someone would like to know about your use of social media and how you're using it to engage or recruit youth. So let's start with Lamar, and then Miranda, and then Tim, if you have anything else to add. So Lamar, are you using any type of social media?
Yes. So we have an Instagram, we have a Facebook, and we have a Twitter account. But I would say with social media, you just definitely have to be consistent with your posting, but also consistent with your messaging. And for us, we do a bunch of interactive activities via social media. So, for example, we had a substance abuse prevention trivia where we posted a substance abuse trivia question, one question per day for 2 weeks. And the youth that, correctly answered the question will receive a gift card. So that's one way to keep them, keep them connected. Another way is just doing basic challenges. Like we may say, okay, post your best prevention message, or post your best photo of, you doing something maybe productive in the community. But lastly, we've done like photo voice too. So that's where you can post a photo which kind of speaks on what you're doing, but again in a positive way in the community. So those are the kind of ways we kind of engage through social media.
Thank you, Lamar. And for those of you who are not familiar with Photo Voice, you can go to what's called the Community Toolbox, and they have directions for how to do Photo Voice. So, Miranda, are you using social media for Promising Futures, and what have the results been?
Yes, so first let me just share Lamar's mentioned using Photo Voice, and I'm glad that you shared the tool where others can access and learn more information about it. But it's an incredibly powerful and accessible tool because it actually, does center the voices of whoever uses it. So in this case, it would be youth. And it's a research tool and has been used in so many ways for like working with indigenous groups and actually getting their indigenous knowledge to address a range of different, topics. But we actually have used Photo Voice as well. But to the question around social media, we are on Instagram and we are on Twitter, and the youth created a Snapchat. And so, how is it helpful? How have we used it? So just like Lamar said, you definitely have to be consistent. And so, the youth actually post. They have like the password, so they post, and we have a conversation. We did a social media training first. That's really important. So it's very clear that, okay, so now you're posting on behalf of the organization versus when you post, in your personal private account. But, in thinking about the ways we use we use the Promising Futures account, we will have the youth actually record themselves when we're in an area that's really highly trafficked by youth in DC. It's the area called Chinatown. We'll go there and do condom street outreach. And so, they will kind of capture their thoughts in real time about like, oh, what it's like, distributing condoms and, some of the things that they're doing. And when we post it, we get, DMs like, oh, why don't y'all come out to, MLK? Well, there's in Southeast DC where like MLK, and Malcolm X come together in Congress Heights. And I'm just like, that's what I'm talking about, right? They see us out here in one neighborhood, and they're like, come to my neighborhood, come to my high school. We need it out here, right? So the fact that we're doing it in real time instead of taking pictures and then posting it, next week, it's like, no, take the pictures and the videos right now because, you're going to get the messages right now and then respond right now. So that would be my suggestions on how to really kind of activate and capitalize on how you can use your social media. But then, of course, we use it to kind of highlight the work that the youth are doing and the partnerships that we have and the like.
Thank you. And I also want to mention we've got a couple of questions around using social media, and so I wanted to let you guys know of a technical assistance opportunity with HIV.gov every Tuesday and Thursday from 2 to 4 p.m. You can schedule a one-on-one 45-minute conversation to speak with one of the HIV.gov social media experts about your unique situation on social media. So if you go to HIV.gov, you can look for virtual office hours, and you can schedule an appointment. The April calendar is wide open, so go right now and schedule your 45-minute appointment with HIV.gov to help you talk about your specific social media challenges, and we will do our best to provide you some solutions. Okay, so I'm not going to ask him about social media because we have a ton of questions, so I want to we'll spend 2 more minutes on questions. And there's 2 I kind of want to combine. So, let's just ask the first question. The first question is about recruiting people when you can't get into schools. So how are our panelists able to recruit people into programs that are outside of school? So I think that's probably a Lamar and a Miranda question, but Tim, let's go with you and see if maybe you have something.
Sure. I mean, that's a good question because, I work in the educational system, but our intervention was not limited to the students youth that lived within our school boundaries. And so we would take pretty much anybody from all areas to make sure that we were servicing the youth that we felt needed it. And let me tell you, some of these kids were starving for some of this information, starving for the connection. And we had youth that would come from like valley areas of LA, and if you're familiar, the valley is really far away from us. And so, you have kids that will show up, and these young people really needed to hear this stuff. I would say that 2 things. One, your CBO partners that you work with are crucial to this because many times, not just us, but they have relationships with other agencies around your community that may have connections to some of the youth you're looking to recruit. So, one, your CBO partner and their partnerships are key because of the relationship factor. And second is using youth to be able to do that. So for one, we used not just our peers in our schools, but we used near peers that were out of the system and in the communities to recruit as well. And then the second option level to that was that when we did the first couple cohorts, we decided that we wanted to engage youth even more within it. So we actually took a couple youth from the original cohort and trained them as facilitators as well, and they facilitated with the adult facilitators. So we had youth facilitators as well in the process. So that really helped them and helped them recruit people as well into the process.
All right, thanks, Tim. Lamar or Miranda, do you want to weigh in on this one?
For me, I would say that, again, like Tim said, your CBOs are going to be really crucial. But, a bunch of out-of-school programs as well as youth centers, faith-based organizations. But one thing that he mentioned that was really big is peer education programs. So with us, we had the YPLC group, and that was our Youth Prevention Leadership Corps, and they definitely help, as peers, recruit other peers, and that's a really big factor when you have youth, recruiting other youth.
I agree. I can, yes. So one of our biggest, I was just responding to one of the webinar attendees and asking questions about how do you recruit and what methods do you use, is it flyers, is it face-to-face, all of the above. And one of our biggest methods of recruitment, especially for the peer education program, because like we talked about the power of the peer model, is definitely word of mouth, hands down. That's definitely, oh, I heard about it from, my best friend was in it, my cousin, and then it just spreads that way. But not to mention, because we are traveling around the city, a lot of them hear about it when we actually do the workshop, and they just want to say, connected to us. And we have our, we have our handle on our T-shirts, and they're like, oh, they'll take a picture or they'll just start following us then, and then they stay connected to it. You know, so there's ways to kind of tie social media piece into the work that you're doing face-to-face, and ways that they, like Lamar mentioned earlier, about how youth, you know, are on their phones and actually tying that into programming. And so we do all of those things.
Thank you so much, Maranda. So we actually here at What Works in Youth HIV, if you didn't know, we did a series of podcasts, and then we also did a storytelling workshop, and then we had different organizations make their own stories. But I wanted to point you to our latest podcast, which was on how to use Snapchat with youth. And I know a lot of you are, well, let me speak for myself. I don't get Snapchat. That's how I knew that I was definitely not a millennial, because I didn't get it. And I didn't get why you would want to use it when all the content disappears. And you know, in some of our organizations, it takes a long time to get things approved. So we were able to attend Youth Tech Health last year in San Francisco, and we met a lovely woman named Karen who works at a Planned Parenthood in Southern California, and she presented on Snapchat, and we got to talk to her for about like 30 or 40 minutes, and she really breaks how to use Snapchat all the way down, how to get your organization to buy into it, how to evaluate it. So we want you to go and listen to that podcast so you can learn those tips as well for those of you who are already using Snapchat or have been thinking about using Snapchat, because we know that the younger your audience, the more likely they are to be on Snapchat. So we are out of time for questions, and this is the most questions we've ever gotten on a webinar. And so I want to thank you guys for being so active on this, and that tells us there's a definite need. So the last question I'll just ask the presenter, since we've been on this social media theme for the last few minutes, is if you could just share your social media handles, and we will put those in. We'll put those on the page where we're going to share the recording, but if you could just shout them out right now so that people can start following you and learn from what you're doing. So let's just go down the line. Tim.
So a couple of things. We have a website. It's AIDSPreventionLAUSD.net. That is the professional kind of way to contact me or get a hold of me, but our youth social media piece is projectula.org. So it's project and then the letter U and then letter A, LA.org. So projectula.org is our social media piece, and that's the one that we helped create with the Art Center College of Design to really kind of bring the youth into that. So if you want an example of that, that's a good place to go.
All right, Maranda.
Okay, we actually can be found online at our website at www.promisingfuturesdc, all one word, .org. And then on social media, Twitter and Instagram, we are Promising Futures, all capitalized letters with no vowels except for the E. So it's PRMSNGFTRES, Promising Futures with no vowels except for the E.
And Lamar.
So for us, our overall website will be drugfreeyouthDC.com. And for our Twitter, it will be the same, at drugfreeyouthDC. And our Facebook and Instagram would all be the same. That's drugfreeyouthDC.
So part of the reason why we're doing this webinar here in April is because next week, April 10th, is National Youth HIV and AIDS Awareness Day. So we want to make sure that you are well aware of that. Check out the hashtag all across social. We will be sharing more information on recruiting and engaging. We'll have some shareable things coming out next week, and so definitely get involved in that day. So I just want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank all of our people who came to the webinar and put their amazing comments into the idea board. That was something we actually decided at the last minute, and I'm so glad that we did, because it's just so rich there. So you can continue to share that link add to it, that kind of thing. And so to see the webinar recording and the slides and the transcript, we will post next week by the 10th, all of that to whatworksinyouthhiv.org. So I want to thank everyone for participating, and we are now ending the webinar.